I'm delighted to introduce Cecilia Sjoholm. I'll try. Who is Professor of Aesthetics at Zuidoorschool University. She has a PhD in philosophy from Radboud University in Holland and a PhD in comparative literature from Stockholm University. She's been a visiting professor at the University of Oslo, Copenhagen, Minnesota, at DePaul University, and at University of Essex, and she's been a research fellow at the Humboldt University in Berlin and the Johann Wolfgang Goethe Universität in Frankfurt am Main. Her research focuses on issues in phenomenology and aesthetics, with a particular emphasis on the history of aesthetics and its relation to politics. Among her many published works are two anthologies, Regionality, Mondiality, Perspectives on Art from 2011, and the volume Translatability from 2011. Then for monographs, Kristeva and the Political, the Antigone Complex, Ethics and the Invention of Feminine Desire, and most recently, Doing Aesthetics with Arendt, How to See Things, published in 2015. And this book is the reason why I invited Cecilia, and also it sort of inspired the idea for this topic and this talk and this series of events. We had a lunch talk yesterday, and tomorrow will be a reading group that you are most welcome to join if you like. Just let me or Tina Stanton know. So the title of this talk is Intertwinements, Rethinking Politics and Aesthetics in Hannah Arendt's Work. And I want to just give a brief introduction and then hand over directly to Cecilia. We take an interest in the world that is thoroughly independent of our life interest, writes Hannah Arendt in her thought diary when reflecting on Kant's critique of judgment. Though disinterested, as Kant says, disinterested, meaning free of practical concerns, we are not at all uninterested in the world. For as Arendt shows, our ability to judge the world derives from the most involved of our senses, namely our sense of taste. Arendt writes, this is again from her thought diary, "It will always remain remarkable that Kant typifies the tremendous phenomenon of the faculty of judgment precisely in using the sense of taste. However much this speaks for his sense of worldliness, it still is symptomatic of his political cluelessness. The private sense of taste, a sense that Arendt says cannot be represented, may seem singularly ill-suited to form the common basis that Kant envisions with his ideas of judgment, with his idea of judgment. Yet, as Arendt claims, it is precisely the irreducible, unrepresentable particularity of taste that enables it to, quote, relate to the particular qua particular. Her description of taste in her lectures on Kant evokes images of eating, of filling up and feeling out the space inside ourselves in an act that is incommunicable, except perhaps in grunts and other noises of eating. The seemingly unbridgeable divide from taste to judgment is crossed by way of imagination, which removes the direct object of tasting and forms an internal representation, according to Arendt. For Arendt, once the object is removed, the conditions for impartiality have been established. The scene is set for judgment, and thus for intersubjectivity. Cecilia Sjoholm's work on Arendt reminds us of the fact that our judgments retain an aftertaste of the absent object. What is ultimately via our community sense constituted as the political in Arendt thus cannot be neatly distinguished from either the aesthetic sense of the world of objects, of taste, smell, sight, sound, and the sensual experience of things. And what the kind of particular attention that Cecilia's book directs on the senses is this connection between the aesthetic and the political. And she writes in the preface, "The political scene heard, felt, and apprehended through a sensible form of being, producing judgment and imagination as functions of sensibility. Aesthetic sensibility, therefore, underlies all forms of political reflection, producing possibilities as well as constraints." Professor Sjoholm's work explores this crucial dimension of Arendt's thought with a delicate ear for the intertwinement of politics and aesthetics. The latter does not, in her thought, serve to open the stage for the former to make its entrance, as a lot of other scholars have recently suggested in reading Arendt, thereby putting aesthetics in the service of politics and in a way stabilizing it. Instead, Cecilia draws attention to the complex interaction between politics and aesthetic that pays tribute to our interest in the world. And interest here in a more general, perhaps even more neutral, if you will, sense. Judgment, as one of the points of intertwinement between politics and aesthetics, aims ultimately at a sense of realness without which we cannot establish meaningful connections. So thank you so much for coming, and I look forward to the lecture.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me here. I look very much forward to the opportunity of discussing Arendt with you. I also look very much forward to be discussing art with you. So the title of the lecture is Intertwinements, Rethinking Aesthetics and Politics in Arendt. I actually should be a bit darker, right?
Yeah, I'll do the light.
In Stockholm last spring, the very famous but also very secretive artist Banksy came to town. Or not. In any case, rumor had gotten around, so people had wandered en masse to an area of frontline galleries. From there, they were brought to a kind of makeshift gallery, where the audience looked at the pieces of art and then joined in a kind of collective graffiti spraying on the walls. After a while, rampage broke out as people started to carry away the pieces. At first, some conscientious individuals tried to stop the looters. Then they gave up. No one claimed ownership of the works of art. Neither artist, curator, nor gallery appeared. A few days later, an anonymous couple came forward and did claim authorship, saying that it was a critique of the commercialization of Banksy's own art. When the show was over, and actually I think this girl was given the mice by somebody who just came forward and said, "Take this." But when the show was over, the pieces, even this one, were simply all gone, except for a doll that had been crashed by a Gucci bag. And the event made it clear there is nothing that contemporary art can do to evade an ever more hysterical commodification. An artist like Banksy and the pieces of outright political criticism that remain iconically on the walls of the West Bank, for instance, such as this one. There are very many of these drawings and paintings on the wall of the West Bank. This one is called Exit Through the Gift Shop. But his pieces have also been subject to commodification, and at other places, for instance in London, they have been cut out from the walls and sold at tremendous prices. And Banksy has himself also appeared anonymously in Central Park and sold pieces there without anybody knowing that it was actually him. So that has also created a kind of hysteria surrounding his work, and of course this sort of event in Stockholm was kind of referring to that. So the event in Stockholm was conceptual. It was not about street art or graffiti, it was about the looting of the works themselves, the naked face of greed. The actual work of art was in fact contained in the empty spaces left behind when it was all over. This singular work hit the nerve of the contemporary art scene in an acute manner. It demonstrated perhaps what Hannah Pitkin has called, if you like, the attack of the blob, with reference to Arendt in order to illuminate what happens when the social sphere fails to be supplemented by the coming together of political action. A bunch of individuals that runs around with no goal in mind, easily moved, distracted and manipulated. The blob is a collectivity that acts not for change but individually, precluding any possibility of change. It describes then a form of impotent collectivity, in contrast to solidarity and a politically active collectivity. In this paper, I would like to discuss the challenge to art and aesthetics today from this perspective. How can art be used to counter commodification and serve political action in the name of collectivity and solidarity? How may we use Arendt's philosophy to counter the collapse of collectivity demonstrated by the Banksy show? In this talk, I will use Arendt to invoke a perspective where art comes to embody possibilities of action that are reducible to individualism, linking our aesthetics to the critique of liberalism. And I will, in this respect, consider three aspects of the work of art in Arendt. First, it offers a resistance against the commodification of the art world. And secondly, it also offers or contributes to the tangible reality, which for Arendt is necessary to make action possible. And thirdly, it can be conceived as an agent, although perhaps a particular kind of agent. I will also look at some works in the visual arts through an Arendtian lens to exemplify what I'm talking about. So the problem of the political and its relation to aesthetics is immediately implicated in the aesthetic foundations of critical theory. The title of this lecture points directly to one of the key problems of critical theory. Walter Benjamin deplored the antagonism between what is named aesthetic pleasure, which was used by fascism when they were, for instance, ordering the military marches, etc., in an aesthetic way, so to speak, and the leftist politicizing of art, which meant that political art had become reduced to content. Adorno, in contrast, argued that the political had migrated into the autonomous work of art. To Adorno, art should not appear political, but is political rather through its forms. For instance, in the way that the Beckett plays kind of implicate the collapse of the modern world, but they do not state it. Both Benjamin and Adorno are held to represent the aesthetic foundations of critical theory, not Hannah Arendt. But I do believe that Hannah Arendt contributes to the rethinking of aesthetics through its intertwinement with the political in a way that is very relevant today. Rather than pointing to the autonomous work of art as a focus of reflection, which, for instance, Adorno did, rather than looking at its ideas, inherent concepts, and dialectical potency, she points to the work of art, implicitly at least, as a point of view, as inflicted in a context, and as an agent, marked by a specific kind of steadfastness. As Theodor Adorno showed in Negative Dialectics, the philosophy of the subject, from Kant to Hegel, posits freedom in the identity of the self and related to reason. After the Second World War, however, in the face of the Cold War and the threat of the atom bomb, the acute need of thinking the subject in a new way was imminent. In Negative Dialectics, Adorno makes clear that we need a new rational theory of reason, he puts it. Reason having become not only a method of philosophy, but an aspect of the troubling mentality of something that he called the cold bourgeoisie, which to Adorno had ruined Europe. One could argue that Adorno's aesthetic theory produces the idea of a certain possible afterness of a subject, which has presented itself as cold. A shift of philosophical focus, which leads us to figure the possibilities of subjectivity in new ways. Adorno, motivated perhaps by the same political need of a radical shift in the thinking of the subject, confronted the problem from another viewpoint than Adorno. Rather than positing the autonomous work of art as a utopian figure of freedom, which Adorno did, Arendt posited plurality, situatedness, and agency. Unlike Adorno, she did not place art and aesthetics as a focal point of her philosophy. This does not mean, however, that questions of art and aesthetics are absent from her writings. One may, in fact, argue that these questions are embedded in her philosophy. In Arendt's writings, there is no object replacing the subject, rather a singularity presenting itself in a plurality that grounds all appearances. Substituting the transcendental grounds of sensus communis in Kant with notions of plurality, in a reading of the Critique of Judgement, Arendt confronts, although indirectly perhaps, the Eurocentric and masculinist legacies inherent in the ideas of the sovereign subject, whilst maintaining a legacy of critical reflection and freedom. We need, through an Arendtian perspective, to consider context, perspectives, and styles in order to understand the way in which art implicates a form of sensibility, which is perhaps not political per se, but rather imbued with the same categories of conditioning as those that shape the political. In the human condition, the work of art is given a particular stature. It offers permanence. As an envoy for the Central for Jewish Cultural Reconstruction after the war, Arendt worked herself with a mapping of the state of the cultural Jewish heritage in post-war Germany. Having seen a cultural heritage break to pieces, she also witnessed the importance attached to material sustainability of works of culture and art. To Arendt, political action is made possible through the kind of temporality that is sustained by notions of permanence. We act in a world where we can conceive of our act as having a value of a time, where we can conceive of values such as sustenance. And such a value is offered to us through our cultural heritage. The notion that works of art offer a value of permanence, which serves the possibility of action then, is more than a note in the margin of the human condition. It is a remark based on the observation of the intrinsic relation between cultural and political catastrophes. Cultural objects condition what Arendt considers in terms of bios, or political forms of life, and they are not replaceable by other kinds of objects. This is the intrinsic relation between the political and art. Art, aesthetics, and cultural objects maintain a life world to which politics is absolutely obligated. This argument can be contrasted to the Marxist conception of commodity fetishism, where consumer goods become symbols for social exchange. One may argue that Arendt's reason for being wary against orthodox Marxism, perhaps, against the background just given, lies in the fact that to her, commodification is not merely a problem of exchange. Commodification entails a disaster. it entails that the things that sustains political life disappears. To Arendt, a work of art is a gathering point that cannot be degraded into use value, and it is irreducible to commodity. It is not simply a dead thing, nor an object of surplus values available on the market. Neither can it be conceived only in terms of desire, or in a dialectic duality between object and subject. A work of art is situated in a field of shared perspectives, usages, and impacts. Asserting that only tangible things from the cultural world, things such as, and I quote, books and paintings, statues, buildings, and music, can give us some kind of comprehension of our history, Arendt may appear to speak for a conservative humanism, where high culture is held to be at the peak of world-making. However, in the light of the aggressive forms of commodification that dominate our current life world, commercializing everything from cultural heritages to day habits, the idea that works of art and culture offer a world is not necessarily reactive. Arendt's position does not mean that we need to return to the classics. It does not mean either that we need to return to old methods and materials. An artwork can also remain through its impact and its memory, as in the Banksy performance. Values of permanency are created in and through a space of intersecting and interacting agencies. The ruinations of commodification is a more subtle and cunning process than the downright destruction of a cultural heritage. Nevertheless, it may be equally powerful. I may take as an example here, perhaps a contestable example, the work of Cindy Sherman, who was exhibited at the Modern Museum in Stockholm last fall. The exhibition was done in a form of a retrospective, which meant that her most famous works since decades had been gathered and placed next to one another. In the 80s and even the 90s, the work of Cindy Sherman was at the front line of a new kind of photographic feminism, undoing, redoing, and displacing the features of gender ideology. At the exhibition, however, an exhausting effect due to the sheer numbers of images was produced. The same effect cancelled out access to any critical potential inherent in the images. Sherman's self-portraiture was, from early on, queer and critical of any heteronormative invocations of the gaze. It clearly questioned and undermined heteronormative representations of sexuality. Over time, however, as one walked into the exhibition, Sherman's images seemed to have succumbed to the commodification and commercialization that have followed with their success. As a consequence, it was difficult to see the challenging, queer or abject imagery, or at least to see only that. What one saw was also the gesture of self-portraiture embracing itself, poking on the same nerve in the photographic lens, and the salability of the name of Sherman. What appeared was not only the commercialization of Sherman's images, but in fact the commodification of spectatorship itself, drawn en masse to another superhit show. And let us in this context consider a film commenting on precisely this phenomenon, produced by Marisha Lewandowska and Neil Cumming. This is a clip or a still from a film which they made in 2008, which was called Museum Futures Distributed, depicting an imagined future dialogue between somebody working in an archive and a museum director in 2058. And the film goes on and on with a dialogue that clearly indicates some kind of absolute merger between finance and art. It is absolutely unintelligible what they say to one another. They use words such as local, global, co-producing, composites, etc. But it doesn't mean anything. It's just some sort of lingo. And what comes forward is just that an absolute merger between art and the sort of economic development that museums also embody. As Terry Smith has noted, this film marks, he calls it, the triumph of the conformist contemporary. The film seems to illustrate a future that has gone much further than the Adornian vision, where art has adapted to a pattern of entropy. In the film, art has not only succumbed to the language of commodification, it has become a central tool of an economy where entropy, or a saturated form of uselessness and indifference, is no longer an effect but a plain goal, not only in the production of art, but of the economy as such. Here, the work of art is no longer an object of permanence, in the sense that it would offer some kind of resistance against such an entropy. Art has simply been swallowed up and become any kind of commodity with no distinguishing marks at all. And I should add that Marisa Lewandowska, who made this film, I just discovered that she was actually an artist in residence here the year after that she made this film. So then, going back to Hannah Arendt and the kind of things that I think that she could make us see in art and questions of the aesthetic, and relating that to political action. To Arendt, art and political action have in common their appearance in the public sphere. A work of art represents a form of agency. It is not simply to be regarded as a remnant from a disappearing world, a world of manufacturing. Its unique quality lies in its direction towards public space. Public space is a space of action. To Arendt, this means that it is intrinsically related to freedom. When public spaces are shut down or commodified, freedom, and thereby the possibility of political action, loses an arena of emergence. A question to be looked at then, how does political action appear in relation to art and aesthetics? Any conception that we may have of political action is derivative of its practice in some kind of tangible reality, Arendt calls it. Political action can only be thought through its actual appearance, through individuals, collectives, objects perhaps, that act, speak, and move in public space. Arendt's idea that the political must be attached to public space may be relying on a retroactive, reactive, and reactionary exclusionary fantasy, perhaps, and may perhaps even be poorly conceived. If one looks for pieces of criticism against it, one needs not look far. For instance, Wendy Brown has said that Arendt's theoretical formulation of action has rendered action impossible because she takes the Greek repudiation of the body and material life so far that despite her idolatry of political action, she eliminates the very possibility of it. For action, Brown says, requires not just thought and words, but a body, and Arendt refuses the body entry into politics. And Wendy Brown is not the only critic to have said that, quite a few people have said that. But if one looks at Arendt's notion of action in its distinct relation to public space and plurality, however, things appear otherwise. Arendt never leaves the realm of the sensible, a realm which she develops further in her Kantian lecture and in Life of the Mind, for instance, but which was also implied in the human condition. In this way, she by no means disengages the body. Plurality is a function of embodiment, and it is immediately attached to the senses. Plurality is manifest in public space. To Arendt, public space is crucial for plurality to be conceived. But plurality in itself is not something we observe. It is needed for us to perceive a world at all. What we perceive as tangible reality is an effect of plurality. And what is fundamental here is the presence of others' bodies and of other bodies. Perception develops in and through the presence of other bodies. In the European history of modern aesthetics, aesthetics is often related to the emergence of the idea of an autonomous work of art. However, contemporary, ancient, and early modern aesthetic experience, political or not, are all interwoven with a variety of uses, crossing cultural, medial, expressive, and sensual boundaries, as well as exploring new forms of knowledge. Rethinking the fundamental presuppositions concerning aesthetic experience means freeing it from isolation and deploying it in a multifaceted interconnection with other significant practices. And one of these is, of course, politics. Arendt does just this in her reading of Kant's Third Critique. She offers a way of perceiving this. For some, Arendt's reading of Kant opens a promising politicization of citizenship based on responsibility and judgment. For others, it is a flat account of merely imagining everyone else's opinion. But I think that one can use the spatial metaphors used by Arendt. In this regard, judgment, like public space, is a product of the encroachment of others. The notion of enlarged thought, that is really a larger thought, places judgment at the level where it informs both consciousness and perception. This is what makes aesthetics political. From the position of individuals, we may embrace the perspective of a community, or not. This community does not come about through identification, but through aesthetic judgment. The remarkable character of Kant's idea of aesthetic judgment is that it forces itself on us whilst being experienced as free. The free play of the faculties that we experience as pleasurable in the encounter with beauty has nothing to do with free will, but is imposed on us through the very forms of perception. This is the paradoxical ground upon which Arendt's reading of Kant's political philosophy is based. In Kant, disinterestedness represents freedom at the transcendental level. In Arendt, freedom can only be thought through plurality. The coercion involved in judgment involves a certain giving up of the core of subjectivity, and this is precisely the point. Judgment teaches us what it means to think not just for ourselves, but to think in and through others. To Arendt, Kant shows that thinking is not a solitary affair, but is dependent on others. For Kant, an enlarged thought comes, ideally, from the position of the spectator. Placed next to the grand spectacle of the French Revolution, without being able to participate, Kant experienced man's perpetual progress through an optimism and enthusiasm only made possible through the position as spectator. In the tradition of contemplation, initiated through Plato's cave, the spectator is immobile. It would appear then that we would need to choose between two kinds of life, a political active life on the one hand, and a philosophical contemplative life on the other. As Arendt saw, however, the idea that contemplative life is immobile and inactive has less to do with contemplation itself and more to do with the condition of isolation in which Plato's spectator is situated, for instance. Sensus communis, to Arendt, is not the disinterested agreement of a sum of isolated individuals, but the affirmation of a plurality that we have either experienced or expect to experience. Judgment, therefore, involves a capacity to think in the place of others, a capacity which is active, moving over several positions, a capacity for acceptance, tolerance, and empathy, perhaps, but one cannot reduce judgment to these capacities. One may interpret Arendtian judgment as an active, reflective flexibility, moving not from the singular to the general, but involving various perspectives already at the level of perception. Here we need imagination and the capacity to imagine the perspective of a different social position, perhaps, another gender, culture, ethnic group, not at the level of opinion, but precisely at the level of perception. Judgment claims a reflection other than just empathy. It does not merely involve the acceptance of others, but the capacity of a more radical transformation. It forces me into a position where my sensibility is always encroached upon by the sensibility of others. This is, of course, why Kant's theory of judgment works with aesthetic examples, if one reads it that way. Works of art provide the sensation of other viewpoints. We do not experience aesthetic pleasure as a mere private sensation. To think in the place of others means to engage in alternative positions of experience or perception, imagining another perspective in spatial and temporal terms. Imagining somebody else speaking, feeling, and sensing, coordinated by the social and geographical factors. This involves a transformative capacity evoked by our senses, and to experience our view of the real, of a tangible reality in a new way. It is certain that art can contribute to this. There is art can be said to have a particular place in Arendt's thought, but it is not only an object of judgment. It is something that influences the way in which we make judgments. Objects of art offer material resistance in their thinginess that may not present a direct cause for action, but they contribute to a tangible reality that must accompany any theory of political action. Art and literature, therefore, has a special place in the formation of the public sphere. This does not imply that the public sphere simply offers a solid, durable, and common world. It means rather that we are impinged on, not only by those who share our immediate environment, but also by fictional figures, their stories, views, and insignia. The importance of art lies in the way it is implicated in the reality we perceive, extending shadows from the imaginary world to the world of the living. Art is made to appear, sometimes through the invisible threads of disappearance. Through its sensible qualities, it makes public space a product of aesthesis, implying a web of finite singularities extending the life through the invisible gulfs that help produce our perception. Arendt's notion of plurality does not imply merely that we are individuals in a world of other points of view. It implies rather that the sensible apprehension of the world itself is a product of a form of constant impingement. My sensibility is always encroached on by the sensibility of others. Now it is time to return through these ontological excavations to the question posed at the beginning. How is it possible today to avoid serving the industry of commodification and exhibit art in a political manner? How is it possible to exhibit works of art in a manner that does not merely imply critical gestures, but that evokes values of solidarity and collectivity? Maybe this has to do with the material and aesthetic power of a work of art that offers a kind of sensorial impingement, affecting the manner in which our immediate environment is perceived. Artworks may impinge and encroach on the way in which we perceive things, displacing and relocating sensible forms of apprehension. In this way, the word is a product of aesthesis. what practices of art can do is precisely to provoke such impingements. These impingements can also be performed not only by the living to the living, but by the dead to the living. And a classic example of such an object was made in 1992 by American artist Frederick Wilson in a project, very spoken about project called Mining the Museum, where he placed objects from the Maryland Museum of History in unexpected conjunctions with one another. For instance, in this piece, metal works, where slave chains were placed under a collection of silver. Metal then meeting metal, but objects having a completely diverse connotations. And here, these objects really impinge on one another, but they also encroach on us. They become implicated in the reality we perceive, extending shadows from the world of the dead to the world of the living. Lives are made to appear through objects that make appear perhaps something that Edouard Glissant has spoken about in terms of relation, stretching from the 17th century to the present. Relation being a term actualizing the kind of world-making that took place with colonialism. To Glissant, the world appeared not with a philosophy of the Greeks, but with the colonial relations in which we are still implied. Another perspective-changing appearance is to be seen around on the sidewalks of the Bayerische Viertel in Schöneberg in Berlin. Here signposts give witness to the increasingly terroristic laws that haunted the German Jews from the 1930s and onwards. The signs are part of an art project by Renata Stier and Friedrich Schnock called Places of Remembrance: Isolation and Deprivation of Rights, Expulsion, Deportation and Murder of Berlin Jews 1933 to 1945. As we follow the signposts on the walk in which these signs are placed, we approach the city hall in Schöneberg. We see the dehumanization implied by the laws increasing gradually year after year. And these signposts are kind of placed chronologically. And I discovered that this signpost, for instance, is from 1939. Jews must give up all their jewelry. And today that has a specific kind of connotation also because I took this example also in my book, but as I wrote the book, after I wrote the book, there was also a law that was taken in Denmark, which means that you can actually take of refugees everything that they own exceeding a certain sum, except their wedding rings. So it has a very sort of uncanny resonance with this, what happened here and what the work of art actually makes appear. What Stiers and Schnock's work that was placed in the Bayerische Viertel already in 1992 manages to do is to perform a work that changes our perception. The signs that are placed in a certain walk heading toward the Rathaus in Schöneberg changes a radical shift in our view of the immediate environment. We perform the walk and do something that manages us to see what happened and relate that relate us to a history that is no longer just past but present. Performing this walk, we also come together in a certain way, us doing the walk. What comes into being is something that the artwork forces us to. We experience a kind of collectivity as we perform the walk. The things that we see, hear, and experience are filtered through the encroachment of others. So how are we then to conceive of the work of art as an agent, which is another aspect of art that Arendt implies? A work of art cannot be free to act as a human being, so how can it be an agent? Although one may argue that freedom is one of the most important political concepts in Arendt, it is also one of the most difficult to seize, perhaps. One must here begin by grasping what it is not. In On Revolution, we are reminded that liberation and freedom are not the same. Liberation may condition freedom, but liberation implies that we are liberated from something, which does not necessarily lead to the freedom of action or creation. Freedom cannot be thought, to Arendt, of in the negative sense as freedom from. The liberal mistake has consisted precisely in this, in thinking freedom as a freedom from politics, state intervention, and contractual guarantees. Freedom cannot be thought of as mere possibilities of choice or a function of the will. It has little to do with the liberal impulse that we should be free to choose. But liberalism is not only the political term which fails to implicate freedom in the proper sense. Arendt's freedom is not defined by reason or conceived as sovereignty. It is not a result of democratic regulation. It is irreducible to laws and political cultures. It is also not an inner life, the capacity to think and feel as a free being, or existential. Freedom to Arendt can be instead conceived to something that she calls natality, the possibility of new beginnings. It can only be realized in and through a populated horizon, an infinite diversity of appearances. This entails a direct paradox. In Arendt's conception of freedom, others, through this concept of natality, are in fact impinging upon our choices, decisions, and actions. Because natality implies finitude, our horizon is always finite, in that it exposes itself in plurality. In Arendt's conception of freedom, then, others are impinging upon our choices, decisions, and actions. It would appear that the encroachment of others would hinder freedom from realizing itself. But on the contrary, it conditions freedom. The freedom to act can only be thought through the limitations that come with plurality. The facticity of plurality will always precede my capacity to act. Plurality will, on the one hand, allow for my freedom to realize itself. There is no plurality manifested in a totalitarian society, and therefore no possibility for me to act as a free human being. On the other hand, my actions will always threaten to destabilize and undermine any given order. I cannot know the end of the cycle of events or effects that my actions give rise to. This is a form of finitude that in fact serves my freedom. If I knew the outcome of my actions, I would not act according to the principle of freedom, but rather for the principle of means in order to reach a certain end, which is not freedom proper to Arendt. The public realm, in that way, serves to disessentialize, if one like, the concept of freedom. It offers a space that does not necessarily, in effect, have to be realized by a human agent. What conditions action and thought is not necessarily human. A work of art represents freedom in the particular sense that Arendt gives to that concept. Freedom not as a freedom of choice, but as a sphere distinct from the life in which we are subjectivized. As a work of art is introduced into a public space, we have no possibility of overseeing the consequences. Augustine asserted that man has no power over his own creations. Humans are always strangers in front of their own things and their own world. In Jean-François Lyotard's famous critique, Arendt is outed as a humanist for having anthropologized Kant's second critique. What becomes transcendental in reasoning Kant, and the freedom which is submitted to the law, becomes empirical in Arendt, Lyotard argues, and he thinks that is absurd. But natality in Arendt becomes to Lyotard some kind of realization of innovation, a kind of humanist belief in eternal possibilities. But what Lyotard forgets is that Arendt never equates natality simply with endless possibilities. If there is freedom, it is because there is finitude. Plurality implies a finite being, not a cyclical form of being. It implies a political being, not biological life. Plurality implies a well-framed horizon. Public space, that is the squares, institutions and buildings that stand at center point in an ancient polis, but also in modern cityscapes. As Arendt shown in The Human Condition, natality is born out of appearances of public space, agencies that are singular and finite. Equally critical of Arendt, Slavoj Žižek considers her to have been unable to break out of the bourgeois obscurantism that she inherited from Heidegger, a humanism posing as the undoing of humanism. According to Žižek, Arendt may be critical of the apolitical attitude that she sees as bourgeois, but she is still unable to fully fathom the bourgeois ideology informing her own ideas of political action, in that she focuses it on a certain idea of the human. But if we look at the logic of Arendt's arguments, we lose the essentialist implications. It is not the multitude of humans that condition freedom. It is the facticity of plurality itself. As Hobbes understood, for instance, and Arendt quotes this, if we interpret the idea of zoom political, the human animal, as a definition of humanity, we lose sight of its political implications. The political is never in people. The idea that man is a political being is based on differentiation, rather than any concept of the human. Humans can only be thought of as plural, and it is thereby impossible to essentialize any such thing as the human. Every idea of humanity as one form or essence goes against a concept of freedom that would be consistent and non-contradictory. What conditions human life is not human nature. There is no way to summarize the human according to, for instance, the sum of her biology and history. Therefore, there is no way to conceptualize freedom on the basis of presumptions concerning humanity. One of Kant's questions quoted by Arendt in the series of lectures that preceded the third critique was indeed, what is man? The purpose of that question is not to presume anything above or beyond man that would serve to define him. It points to the possible conditioning of man, not his essence. The work of art may unravel the unique quality of a singular being in the same way that human action may unravel the unique quality of a single human individual. A work of art does not have a life in public in the form of a thing, in the form of a representative of eternal values. A work of art is a kind of agency through its singularity, a who unraveled in the plurality of public space. A collective with which one can identify, based on distinguishing marks such as gender, a collective with which one can identify may be based on distinguishing marks such as gender, ethnicity, and age. In the kind of collective that is, or collectivity that is produced through the display of art, however, the arbitrary factor is crucial. It is a contingent construction, rises and deflates with the artwork itself. There is no recipe for producing a moment of collectivity and solidarity through art. It may or may not happen. What art can do, however, is perhaps to attempt to counter the blob that I talked about in the beginning of this paper, the erring of individuals unable of political action as a collective of action unable to act in concert. And what we see, I think, more and more today are works that really try to grapple this issue. A kind of works that Arendt would perhaps talk about as allowing to engage in this kind of action in concert. In this context, for instance, we may invoke the world's currently most famous and directly political artist, Ai Weiwei, who currently has worked preeminently on refugees at Lesbos. He has set up a studio there. Ai Weiwei shut down an exhibition in Denmark precisely as an act of protest against the new law that forced the police to deprive the refugees of their personal belongings, exactly what was implicated by this sign in this work of art. As a protest against the European Union shutting its borders, he placed life vests covering the concert hall in Berlin in February as an act implicating and I would say forcing a kind of solidarity through the work of art itself. And I just wanted to show you that this is a picture that was taken by a student of mine, Angelica Harms, who went to the island of Lesbos, where Ai Weiwei is now working, setting up his studio. And this is a site that almost all photographers, she's a photographer, would go to, because it's kind of like a life vest graveyard. It's kind of assembling all the life vests that people have traveled with from Turkey to Greece. So Ai Weiwei took life vests, and I think it was from this site, to the concert hall in Berlin, and placed them in this, I would have to say, very, very beautiful way. These life vests are known to all today as symbols of the refugees trying to come to Greece from Turkey, risking their lives on the sea with these vests that are often sold expensively as fakes, not floating at all. They are signal orange, impinging on us through their bright colors. As they appeared on the pillars of the concert hall, they imposed a kind of collectivity on their spectators, invoking the need of solidarity at a moment that has come and gone in Europe which was in fact the demonstration of solidarity. And what the work of art did was to implicate the necessity to return to that moment, a kind of action in concert, if you like, and this is actually a concert house as well, in which Angela Merkel, supported by German citizens, for instance, promised to receive 500,000 refugees. At that same moment last fall, actions in concert really did take place at several places in Europe. Enormous amounts of voluntary work being performed for the refugees, money collected, etc. Then that moment went away and the borders were absolutely shut. If we are to follow the lesson taught to us by Arendt, however, and I think that we should, we need to conceive of art as a condition of political life that can and must consciously withdraw from commodification and fetishization. This can never be achieved by simply adding individual objects that appear to carry such qualities. It is achieved through the way in which objects produce a spectrum of sensual qualities that impinge on our sensations, producing a kind of framing of a collectivity through their very appearance. So the quality of permanence of art that I want to evoke here, the quality in art that resists destruction under commodifying and fetishistic forces, has less to do with material sustainability than with appearances. The context, the space, the history, the situation, the public space is as important or more important than the object as such. And this is something that Ai Weiwei really worked with. So this was this is a very crude, if you like, political object, and that was also precisely the point. If art is to be political, if it is to impinge on our vision, it has as much to do with the way in which it is shown as with the object as such. In other words, the political has not migrated into the work of art, as Adorno argued. Instead, we live in a world which is full of appearances of art, acting on our mind and on our perception. In being shown, read or seen, works of art create forms of collectives through certain arbitrary factors. They simply turn up, so to speak, and suddenly our perception of the environment we're in has changed. This is also what incorporates the freedom of art, and what makes it incorporate a form of political action, which is irreducible to any other kind. Thank you.
Questions? Roger, if you have a question.
I think we can hear him.
So, Cecilia, that was great, and I really, I find the work challenging and wonderful. As with the book, I take, if I understand it correctly, I take fully your points about the importance of art to the constitution of a reality, and I love the way you link plurality and this idea of impinging upon one's sensibility. So if I have a place where I start to lose you, I guess, it's in your attempt to answer this question of can art counter the blob, and your judgment, I guess, about some of these modern artworks that they do something like that. So a few things that I guess come to mind that I love you to try and convince me of. For Arendt, and you know this, so I don't mean to say anything you don't know, but the artist needs to come out of darkness. And as you said in your book, I don't know if you said it in the lecture, the artist can't be a public figure. The art is a public figure, but the artist is not. That would simply disqualify Ai Weiwei as an artist in an Arendtian idea. But more than that, I would say that his art doesn't do what art needs to do from an Arendtian point of view, which is shock us. Now, it may, I don't think it shocked anybody, but it may shock a couple people. It may earn him a couple of newspaper articles. But I mean, in all honesty, I'm a fairly literate person. I hadn't even heard of this, right? Okay, maybe it's the European community, although I did spend all of March in Paris. I don't know when this happened. But, for Arendt, art has to be, the reason it can't come from a public figure and must come from someone who's a recluse, someone who's, in a sense, stands away, is because it has to be so original and so new that it really does shock us, and either forces us the judgment that this person is a criminal and they've done something really awful, or we have to sort of look at it and say, oh my God, we have to keep talking about it. And as we talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, we tell stories about it, and it becomes part of our reality, right? And one of the problems that we have today is that we don't have a public world, what Arendt, I think, would call a space of appearance, where art can appear, because there's so many different little realities, there's not a reality. There doesn't seem to be a world a common world left, or it seems very hard to imagine, where any work of art would appear to a people. There's not an agora, there's not a central area, there's not a marketplace. And so I guess, there's a couple questions in here. One is about agency, one is about whether a public art figure can be an artist today. But it seems that the real missing link is Arendt's worry that we no longer have a common world. Insofar as I would say we no longer have plurality. We have, she talks about in the human condition how action is made increasingly rare by what she calls the law of large numbers, right? And the larger the numbers, the more all surprising action seems like simply a statistical aberration, right? And it's impossible to shock us and to surprise us in a way that action requires. And I think that's much of the problem art is having. It tries increasingly to shock, but it's unable to do so because it's seen as just what art does today, try and be silly, and we laugh it off after a couple of weeks. I don't know, it's, I take your Arendt analysis really seriously. I just wonder if you're too overconfident in the power of art and maybe not worried enough about the loss of a public space through these law of large numbers, and which makes action really rare and impossible today. If not impossible, Arendt would never say impossible, but increasingly difficult and rare. I don't think that the works of art that will actually change our world are going to be done by artists today. I think they'll be done by people who come from completely surprising outsider status, and they will be new in some way that we don't yet expect. The art world has become too much of one mind to expect people in the art world to actually produce art that surprises us, or so it seems to me. But I'm wondering how you...
Yeah, that is the problem. I mean,
Yeah.
like I said at the beginning, I mean, it is a totally commodified world, so it doesn't seem to have that quality that Arendt would like to give to it, But on the other hand, I mean, you can see at the other end, I mean, what happens when, cultural objects get really destroyed, or the cultural heritage gets destroyed. I mean, as you could see what has been happening in Syria, for instance. I mean, it's very much connected to a destruction which is something which is completely fundamental. But then you say, I mean, there were so many questions that you were adding. I'm trying to unravel it. There's no people trying. Yeah, but were there ever people? I don't know.
Were there ever people?
Yeah, I don't know. Or did you say that there's no people that art can talk to, or?
Well, was there ever a common people?
A common people, yeah. But then again, was there ever
A space of appearance?
Yeah.
I mean, to a certain extent, you're right, they have to be brought into being.
Yeah, precisely. So, but I think, what one can do with Arendt in these matches is it's kind of reconstruct her a little bit, and I admit I very much do that. And so for me, the question about art was actually not so much about, what can art do to really, I mean, is there a recipe for art to actually change, the way we perceive things, etc. But more the sort of question, what do art have to struggle with today? And I think that Arendt indicates some of that in talking about plurality, in talking about public space, etc. And it's not by coincidence that for me, I feel that Adorno, for instance, I mean, he would perhaps be the producer of for the product of these sort of shocking, artworks, the unexpected, etc. This sort of autonomous thing that would just appear, the sort of absolute symbol of freedom, etc. But for me, what I like about this way of perceiving things, that art, something that sort of rather gathers or attempts to gather, something that appears, that really tries something, is that I really do see a lot of art and artists struggling with that. And then if they succeed or not, I don't know. Maybe this, like Ai Weiwei's attempt is mean, one can see it from your perspective, but I also think that there's something to be said about this sort of, complete, I mean, once you are at this square and you have these life and so on, I mean, there's no way you can escape from that. I mean, you sort of just, surrounded, or, what do you call it, you're sort of gripped by it, So, and I think that is something that, like for instance, the aesthetic theory of Adorno can't really grapple with. But if we go to a rent, we can sort of see, how can those aspects of art actually work on us.
I mean, can I just, when Mohammed Abazi in Tunisia lit himself on fire during the Arab Spring, or to begin the Arab Spring, I don't know if this is a crude thing to say, but that was that has now become a story that makes up our world. I don't know, I don't want to call him an artist, I think that's not fair. He was an actor. To me, there is still a possibility for someone to act in such a way that their story does help create a public world, create stories, narratives. There will be monuments that last. But it's not, and I think one of the questions, and I think a really good question, is why is it not coming out of the art world? And you offer an answer, commodification and other things. But, I mean, I'm wondering what you looking for it in like Ai Weiwei or the German signs, which to me aren't having much lasting impact. What that does, looking for it there, does it turn us in the wrong way? I mean, does that make sense?
No, I would say no. I think they do have an impact on the way you see your immediate environment. I mean, not the whole world, maybe, because I said this is fleeting, it's temporary, and I think it was also for our rent. I mean, it's not that the world is just there, It's a construction that is, subject to change, and I'm not sure if Arendt, when she talks about world, if she talks about that in a sort of global sense. Isn't world something that you experience? I mean, the kind of reality that you live in, and that may be, in a bigger or a smaller context. I mean, she doesn't really define that. But in order for you to act politically, I mean, you have to have a sense of the world in which you act. I mean, otherwise your actions have no meaning. So, yeah.
I could say more, but other people want to jump in.
Well, I had just sort of a bit of a response to some of your questions. And
Can you
also,
say it louder so
yeah,
she can hear?
I have kind of a response to some of the previous questions, and a piece that I was thinking about, because I was just at a discussion with Dred Scott, and he showed film footage of one of his pieces where on Wall Street he was walking around and burning money and asking for money to burn. And I felt like I just find it dangerous to kind of totalize the art world as something that will not produce anything of value because of its commodification, and to consider people who might come from outside of the art world and produce future great works of art somehow not artists. I feel those people are artists, and that people who are, at least in my opinion, participating in the commercialization of the art world are, I mean, maybe, I don't want to say not artists, but somehow working in a different way, but then not to like completely discount anyone who is showing in a gallery today as someone who's not creating viable work. And Dred Scott talked about this duality of being someone who presents in these elitist spaces, but then also tried to take his work out into the public sphere. And I don't know, I was just thinking about how you were saying the idea of an artwork having permanence, but the way that it can have that through perishability, that the burning of this money or that the disappearance of this piece can be what leaves its power. And I guess I've been thinking about that lately and was wondering if you had maybe more to say on that. I guess just like what a future artwork would look like, and yeah, I don't know.
It seems to me as if you know more about what such a possible, future artwork would look like. But I mean, I think cultural heritage is one thing, and if you look at the work of art, I mean, the way that art discussed as in the human condition, it's very material. I mean, it's kind of like libraries, objects that you have, etc. But of course, what we have now is a sort of archive of memories, so to speak, of work of art as well. I mean, because living in the world of a contemporary art scene, I mean, there are as many works that don't actually manifest themselves, but that have kind of added to the life that we're in now. And so it's and as I understand Arendt, these are kind of the traces that make up of the in-between that forms our world as well. So it doesn't have to be manifested in the form of actual appearances, but memory is as important as the actual manifestation. And thinking about possible future of art, I don't know, but I do think, I mean, for me what was important in showing, I mean, these kind of like really, up there manifestations that Ai Weiwei is doing is kind of like, if you do go to talks on art and aesthetic theory, I mean, you most of the time you get more sophisticated examples, they're a bit more, you have to think about it a bit more, they're not so upfront as this, and that's precisely why I wanted to show this, because I think this is a work of art that, Arendt, she indicates to us in what way we can grapple with it, what does it want to do, and why was this necessary for Ai Weiwei? Because for him this is an action, and it's an action that was for him necessary. And actually thinking about Ai Weiwei, I mean, I would say that he did change a lot of things. I mean, in the way, for instance, that he became a prominent figure through not being in China. Speaking about absences, through actually, not being there. I mean, he made a lot, for political protest in China. So I wouldn't say that he's just this sort of commodified artist, famous, that hasn't done anything. I would say rather that he's incredibly aware of his own stature politically, and he does something with it. And I think that's very interesting.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, which was works of art provide the sensation of other viewpoints, and I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of the collection and display in museums of non-Western cultures, and especially with kind of Western museums, like modern kind of practices of collection and display in Western museums having roots in colonialism and kind of the rise of anthropology, thinking about difference in other cultures. And I have kind of a smattering of questions that I think all get kind of at the same thing. So how does what you're saying relate to the appropriation display of non-Western cultures? What happens when an object is transplanted to a new cultural setting and is reinterpreted in that culture's terms? What kinds of obligations do museums have in terms of bringing awareness to other cultures and providing a space for judgment and imagination? And also obligations they might have in terms of repatriation and accounting for its colonial roots? And also, how might Arendt account for negative aspects of spectatorship or imagining wrongly about other cultures?
Now, these are incredibly important questions. And to take the last one, I don't know, Arendt doesn't have any account of, making judgment that would be bad judgment, so to speak. I mean, she's sort of very affirmative when she writes about judgment, and maybe that's a problem, that she doesn't allow for negativity, really, on those accounts. But I'd say what you're talking about is that is something that I would say, though, it would be more of a problem if you go to Adorno, who's sort of fetishizing this sort of autonomous work of art that is so, this Western, object of art that has become so naturalized in his writings, and that it doesn't allow at all for any other, or even to reflect on the sort of, what is art, what is a cultural object, I mean, what is the difference? I mean, it's just obvious that art is art, and that's what it is, and a cultural object is something else. Whereas I do think that if you read Arendt, I mean, she doesn't make any real distinction between these things, and she doesn't talk about any other cultures than Western cultures. She's very, inhabiting Europe actually. But I think one can transpose her theories to allow to talk about objects, not necessarily these fetishized objects of art, but objects that are meaningful, and then that could be cultural objects of some kind that would not, by Adorno, for instance, be categorized as objects of art. I think her theories would allow for such a transposition. And then the other thing you're talking about, I mean, this sort of appropriation of objects of art by certain collectors in certain countries. I mean, this is a huge problem, I think. Well, I mean, as we all know, I mean, there are all sorts of negotiations going on between countries, that want to have their cultural heritage back, and I think that's kind of pointing to what Arendt is saying as well. I mean, the cultural heritage is incredibly important for the world. So that will be I don't know if that's a response to you.
No, that's good. Thank you.
I enjoyed so much of your talk, and I thought that there were so many exciting ideas. I think as a sociologist, so I was thinking about the political and sociological implications of your argument, but I wondered, to what extent can the analysis be extended beyond just art to thinking about the aesthetic dimensions of, say, cultural traditions, legal traditions? So one way to ask this question would be, how narrowly do we have to define art? So does it have to be art in this sense, or can we think about the aesthetic dimensions of lots of other things and think about the ways that those might be enabling some of these same dynamics that you were describing in your talk? Or, because art is conceptualized as part of an understanding of what judgment is doing, and judgment is broader than just aesthetic judgment, to what extent would there be some implications for judgment in other arenas?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. One can think about these categories in other fields, and it has to do with how do things appear. So aesthetics is broader than just having to be applied to works of art. I mean, it's more about the way that things appear to our senses, and thinking about judgment, there has been quite a bit of work on how judgment can be perceived in terms of political judgment, but also moral judgment. I mean, one can sort of read Arendt in other, Arendt's theory of judgment in other spheres as well. But then, as you well know, I mean, there is a real question as to what Arendt would say about the social, being a problem in Arendt's theory, all in all. So that's something else to. I mean, how do we account for appearances in the social world? How do we account for judgment in social terms, etc.? That's a work that I think that remains to be done. Yeah.
This is in a way related to that question. I'm wondering if there's anything to be said about the status of the material object, if you're from the perspective you're giving an Arendtian account of a work of art. If you imagine works that don't have any material manifestation, would they have the same, could they accomplish the same things that you want to say a work of art can accomplish and be considered a work of art, or is that then something else? And I'm thinking about that particularly because you said a few things about the sensory experience, and so I wonder what you would do with that that question or that problem.
I think if one looks at, for instance, literature, that is, I mean, I didn't talk about that here, but that is also something that remains. I mean, and we don't have, perhaps, we don't need, well, there are books, of course, that giving an account of Homer, which he's quoting all the time, and tragedy and so forth. But we kind of know all these stories without having read them even, perhaps. And they manifest themselves through imagination, which wasn't something that I was talking about so much, but it's a very important aspect also of Arendt's ideas of judgment, that we use imagination, you know, in order to be able to judge. And we use imagination also in a way that sort of impacts in a way that we see the world. So I think that talking about art that doesn't manifest itself materially would have to do with other art forms, perhaps, such as literature, and that fiction and fictional figures are also part of the way in which we view our world and part of our cultural heritage in a way that's incredibly important for the way in which Arendt herself perceives the world.
I'm thinking also of things like Tina Segal's work or conceptual work that is sort of taken up within the realm, not in the realm of literature, but in the realm of, somehow in the realm of the kind of work that's presented at museums, like Segal's work is, but doesn't have the physical manifestation. And I guess what I'm really interested in is whether there's something unique and significant about a material object from this perspective. Even if there are certain categories that you would want to apply to work that doesn't have material manifestation, are there things that Arendt says about material object, or that an Arendtian perspective, as you understand it, would have to say about material objects that's particularly interesting, that wouldn't apply to works that don't have material manifestation?
Well, I wouldn't be able to see something like that, actually. But I think, I mean, if you see something that hasn't material, I mean, you see the empty space, so it's still something that, you know, that informs your sensibility of it, of the space in which you're in. So it wouldn't really not be sensed, you know, although it's sensed in a different way than these kinds of works, for instance. Wouldn't you agree that, or does it have?
I don't know, but.
I have a question for you. I mean, so poetry for her clearly is art, even if it's not written down.
Yeah.
But she says one of the advantages poetry has over maybe Segal's conceptual art is that it, in being rhyming and memorable, can be remembered and held on to and passed down. I think one of the questions that, I mean, I don't know if you agree with conceptual art is, to what extent can conceptual art works remain part of our collective consciousness? And by their title, I don't know. I mean, I think that's the question. Would that be how you would want to look at the question or not?
Well, I think in a way that one can use Arendt to say that yes, it would be part of this, but there would be certain significant works that would sort of add to our archive in world making, so to speak, that would be sort of added to our consciousness about the way we perceive things. But so it has to do with that. I mean, what kind of works have really transpired as significant and sort of added to our cultural heritage? And that wouldn't just be any works. I think it would have to be some works. I mean, I think that would be my response to that.
I think that we have to maybe wrap up fairly soon, but maybe one more question. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I'm just curious, since appearance is one of the key terms around which you formulated your reading. I'm just interested, with whom do you see Arendt developing or a discussion about appearance? Who do you see as the interlocutors with whom you think she thinks about appearance in a particularly thought-provoking and productive way. I mean, there's Merleau-Ponty in Life of the Mind, but I assume you have other voices and figures.
No, my immediate association was with Merleau-Ponty. Because I think, to me, it seems that this is a late work, but it seems to me as when I read Merleau-Ponty, she's kind of, it's like aha, here it is. This is somebody who really adds to my theory of plurality and sort of adds to it in such a way that, I mean, I have the feeling that when she writes Life of the Mind, that she's sort of beginning to understand certain things herself in a way that she hadn't really conceived before. And I know that from Merleau-Ponty scholars, I mean, she misunderstands Merleau-Ponty, but that doesn't really matter because it's a very, if she does, it's a very constructive misreading. So I would say, I think of Merleau-Ponty. I also think of Kant, of course. Vorstellungen, appearances, as being part of the life of the mind, so to speak. And also appearances then being, having to do with the capacity of judgment. And appearances also as having to do with imagination in the way that Kant writes about it in the Herd Critique.
What about Galen and Portman? Arnold Galen?
Yeah, those, yeah.
The two biologists that
Yeah.
she cites quite a bit, who
Yeah.
are both
Yeah.
people she cites over and over again about the nature of appearance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have sort of a second related part. Whom would you position in conversation with Arendt, not maybe someone else, not someone whom she would relate to, but where you think that interlocutor could really illuminate maybe something in Arendt or something that you read in Arendt that we can see through. I mean, Banksy would be one offering that you made. Ai Weiwei. Do you have other, let's say, people you bring to the conversation, to your conversation with Arendt about appearance that you find particularly productive for your thinking through that question?
Well, I have to say, I mean, I don't particularly like post-humanism. I don't like it at all. But I think I'm consciously influenced by it. Also, with reference to your, to what you're saying at Galen and Portland being biologists. I mean, because there is this, aspect of life of the mind as well. I mean, life being life and not human life. So sort of really, coming over that humanist view of what life is. So I'd say that's an aspect of bringing. But I wouldn't want to, refer to any specific thinker in this regard. It could also be a bit Deleuzian, perhaps, if one wants to do such a reading. So I think those possibilities exist.
Thank you very much.